So welcome everyone, I'm Marina Riabiz, and today we talk about optimal tuning of MCMC output. This is joint work with Wilson Chen, John Cocaine, Onur Timur, Pavel Sviatak, Steve Niederer, Lester Mackey, and Chris Oates. Also, you can find me online during the C04 session on the 28th of June. So the main motivation for this talk is in computational cardiology, where we want to make multi-scale and multi-physics models of the human heart. This means that we're integrating different physics, so electrophysiology and mechanics, and we're propagating uncertainty through different scales. So starting from a cell scale to a tissue scale to an organ scale. Now, it is possible to infer the parameters by solving a Bayesian inverse problem at a cell scale, but it is really hard to assess the quality of these samples. And we need to keep in mind that if we want to forward propagate uncertainty, the computational complexity increases at higher scales. So we want to only keep samples that are important or relevant. So this leads us to the formulation of our problem. We want to remove bias from MCMC output, and we want to provide a compressed representation of this output, keeping in mind this idea of forward UQ. Now, on the left-hand side, we have a cartoon representing a distribution of interest P supported on R to the D, and on the right-hand side, we have N samples from a P-invariant Markov chain. It is clear that if we don't do any MCMC post-processing and we approximate the distribution P using an empirical distribution that is equally weighted each of the MCMC samples, this can provide a biased representation of P if the first MCMC sample is sampled far away from P and we have a small number of samples N. Moreover, the fact that the samples are correlated might worsen the quality of Monte Carlo estimators derived from this empirical distribution. And in particular, in this case, we have more samples in one of the two modes. Now, traditional MCMC post-processing involves estimating a burn-in parameter B and a tuning parameter T, so that the distribution P is approximated with empirical distribution obtained after discarding the first B parameters and keeping every T sample. Now, the main issue with this approximation is that it does tackle bias, but we might end up with estimators that have large variance if basically this parameter B is large compared to the number of samples that we have. And moreover, it's possible to prove that thinning also tends to increase the variance of the estimators obtained. And so keeping in mind this scenario in which we have a fixed MCMC output and we want to approximate in the best possible way the distribution P, what we really want to find is a set of indices S, pi 1 to pi m, with m much smaller than n, keeping in mind the idea of compressing and compression of the MCMC output, so that our distribution P is approximated in this way. So still with an empirical distribution, but with delta masses placed in specific points. And so the idea is to find this set of indices S by minimizing a discrepancy measure between the distribution P and its empirical approximation. Now, what we need to specify in this optimization framework are two things. So first of all, what kind of discrepancy we're going to use. And the main idea is that we need to be able to compute this discrepancy, and it has to have interesting properties, so it's a meaningful discrepancy. And moreover, we need to specify how we solve this optimization problem that's combinatorial. So our solution is called time tuning, and I would like to point out that we have a project web page under development where you can find Python and MATLAB code, and our code is on the way. And I would also like to refer you to the archive paper. Now, we need to specify two steps. The first one is the choice of a discrepancy. It is very common in probability and statistics to use the concept of integral probability metric, based on a class of test functions that F that is measure determining, meaning that this quantity is zero if and only if the two distributions are equal. There are two problems using this definition. The first one is that the supremum is not computable because it involves solving an infinite dimensional optimization problem. And the second one is that we don't have expectations against our target distribution P. So we can compute this quantity. However, it is possible to select the class of test function F in such a way that we can get rid of these two problems and still maintain a meaningful discrepancy. So the first bit can be solved by choosing the class F to be the unit ball of a reproducing kernel Hilbert space, and that leads to the concept of maximum mean discrepancy from that of integral probability metric. The second step that we can do, independent of the first one, is choosing the class of functions f to be dependent on the target distribution p in such a way that this integral is zero. And that leads to the concept of Stein discrepancy. Now, if we combine these two steps together, we end up with the concept of kernel Stein discrepancy, or shortly KSD. And it is possible to see from this expression that the KSD is computable, and in fact, it involves summing basically the element of a Graham matrix that requires evaluating only gradients of the log probability density of the target distribution P, and this can be computed as a post-processing step if needed. And it also involves using basically a base kernel K. Besides being computable, the KSD is also meaningful. And in fact, it's possible to show that under some mild conditions on K and P, the KSD is convergence determining. And this means that if this quantity, if this discrepancy goes to zero, then we have that the empirical distribution is converging weakly to our target distribution K. And this can be proved in the case in which the base kernel K is the inverse multiquadric kernel with hyperparameter gamma of this form. Now we still need to specify how we will optimize the KSD. And we propose the following method. Given the set of MCMC output x1 to xn and our kernel Kp, the set of indices S is obtained in a greedy way, meaning that at each iteration J, we scan the entire MCMC output and we select the point that is minimizing the KSD from the empirical distribution that is obtained, adding that point to the set of the previous J-1 points with respect to P. It is possible to show that the cost of this algorithm is at most n times m square. And so it is comparable to the cost of producing the MCMC output when the cardinality of the point set that we produce is fixed. So it is possible to see that the same point xi can be selected more than once, and this condition is actually necessary if m is larger than n. I would like to point out some very recent improvements in this optimization procedure. In particular, it is possible to use a non-myopic approach, and this means that instead of picking one point only at each iteration j, we can select s points, and this is meant to improve the quality of the overall approximation. So, for example, in this cartoon, we can see that if the first point in the myopic method that I described in the previous slide is selecting the first point in the mode of the distribution and the second one very far away, a non-myopic method that is selecting 4 points at the time will strategically place the 4 points to cover better the whole distribution. So furthermore, it is possible to mini-batch the set of candidate points that we scan at each iteration by selecting B points from the initial MCMC output of length n. Now it is possible to show that the solution to these two problems can be cast into the solution of an integer quadratic program with complexity at most m squared times s squared times b to the s. And this is advantages with respect to the method that I showed in the previous slide if the size of the mini batches is much smaller than n. I would finally like to conclude with some theoretical and empirical results. So first of all, a very interesting result, which is aimed at proving the consistency of our method, even with biased MCMC output. In particular, if we have a probability distribution Q such that P is absolutely continuous with respect to Q, and we have a Q invariant, time homogeneous and reversible Markov chain that is obtained using a V uniformly ergodic transition kernel, where I would like to emphasize that the notion of V uniform ergodicity is similar to that of geometric ergodicity, such that this relationship is respected between the function V and the kernel used in Stein-Tinning KP. Then, under some other mild regularity conditions that mainly guarantee that the two distributions P and Q are not too dissimilar, it is possible to show that the KSD between the empirical distribution obtained from the MCMC output MP converges to 0. And we need to specify that this is almost surely because we need to consider the randomness intrinsic in the Markov chains. And furthermore, it is also possible to show that this empirical distribution is also converging weakly to P, again in an almost sure way. And so this is our consistency result. Finally, I would like to conclude with some empirical results that are showing post-processing of MCMC output where the Markov chains were estimating parameters of ordinary differential equations. And so we're solving a Bayesian inverse problem. In the first example, we're running Markov chains for the Goodwin ODE model. So this is a set of ODEs with four-dimensional parameters. And we're selecting M samples out of our MCMC output. In order to assess the quality of our samples, we computed two performance measures. On the left-hand side, we have the energy distance, while on the right-hand side, we have the kernel-state discrepancy based on one of the possible choices for that hyperparameter gamma that we had in the inverse multiquadric kernel. We're comparing traditional thinning in gray, support points in black, and stem thinning in red. And I would like to stress that the energy distance is the quantity that is minimized by support points, which is in fashion similar to our stem thinning algorithm. But the energy distance doesn't guarantee consistency of the empirical distribution obtained, unlike stem thinning. In any case, stem thinning achieves better performance than the other traditional methods, regardless of the performance metric that we're using. I would like to conclude with our motivation example, which is the cardiac cell ODE model. In that case, we have a set of ODEs with 30-dimensional parameters, and here I'm showing just the first three parameters. On the right-hand side, it is possible to see that different rounds of the MCMC get stuck in different local modes. While on the left-hand side, we can see that if we temper the distribution, and so we do introduce some bias in our procedure, but we then correct that using stem thinning, we obtain consistency across rounds. And we're learning something because the posterior has moved from the prior. Our take-home messages are that stem thinning is able to automatically identify and remove the burn-in from the MCMC output. It offers a compressed representation of a sample-based output. It is also possible to remove bias from bias sampling procedures like our tempered target in the last example. However, it is necessary to recall that the MCMC needs to explore a high probability region under P. We need to be able to compute gradients of the log target, which may be expensive, but can be computed as a post-processing step, as I mentioned earlier. And finally, it is still under study the behavior of the kernel-state discrepancy when the high probability regions under P are distant, or where the dimension of the problem is very large. And with that, I would like to conclude, and thank you for your attention.